Neurological Disorders Lesson 2.1. How are neuronal structures specialized for function? The goals of this lesson are to introduce students to the basic structures and functions of a neuron, and to explore how neuronal structures can be specialized for different functions. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to draw a neuron and label its primary structures, including the dendrite, cell body, initial segment, axon, and synapse, describe the function of the primary structures of a neuron, and give examples of how neuronal structures are specialized for different functions. We'll achieve these goals by comparing and contrasting sketches of neurons with a Socratic discussion and creating models of neuronal pathways. To prepare for this lesson, you'll need to review the key scientific concepts that will be presented in it. They include neurons as the cellular building blocks of our nervous system, neuronal structures and their functions, including the dendrites receive inputs, the cell body maintains cell life, the initial segment processes inputs, the axon signals electrically and provides a transport route, and that the synapse signals chemically. And finally, that neuronal structures are specialized for function. You can review this scientific content in the background reading provided to you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in the lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure, including instructions on how to manage the discussion and activity. And the student workbook provides additional explanation for students. You'll need to be sure to print the lesson worksheet and homework worksheet for your students. For this lesson, you may also want to have clay or Play-Doh. Some classes have enjoyed making their neuronal models out of 3D substances, so you may want to have some on hand in case that's something that your class would enjoy doing. The key point of the lessons due now is to review the relationship between structure and function. Specifically, when a language processing structure like Broca's or Wernicke's areas are compromised, it results in specific behavioral symptoms. For example, Broca's aphasia results in difficulty producing speech. Wernicke's aphasia results in difficulty understanding language, and conduction aphasia results in difficulty getting Broca and Wernicke's areas to work together. We'll get there by reviewing the homework from last night, in which students diagnose patients with different aphasias. To complete the homework worksheet successfully, students need to apply their understanding of the relationship between brain structure and function to predict which areas of the brain were affected, and provide a diagnosis based on a patient's script, which gives their responses to a question about how to get to the store. Caution: this does tend to be tricky for students because it involves paying careful attention to the patient's dialogue and noticing the difference between being able to speak and being able to understand, and being able to do both. If students need additional help with this assignment, they can refer to the workbook reading for lesson 1.5. The key points of the first activity are to introduce the three primary structures of all neurons: dendrites, cell body, and axon, as well as introduce the function of neurons. We'll get to this key point by comparing and contrasting pictures of neurons that are included on PowerPoint slide number 2, all of which have dendrites, cell bodies, and axons, albeit each of these structures takes on different forms in each of the neurons pictured, but they are all present in each neuron. The first activity also introduces the idea that neurons have many functions by asking the students to review what has happened to be able to read The Cat in the Hat, the example that we used in lesson 1.5. The key points of the discussion are to review that neurons are cells, and to explore the function of neurons, including receiving inputs, processing inputs, and sending signals. We'll also explore the structure of neurons, including dendrites, cell body, initial segment, axon, and synapse. We'll get to these key points with a Socratic discussion. First, you will review with your students that neurons are cells, which means that they contain all the cellular organelles found within cells to support cell life. You use slide number 4 to review the organelles found within cells with your students. If your students are unfamiliar with these organelles, you may need to take additional time to explain them, but for students who have already had a course in biology, this should go quickly. The next set of slides allow you to introduce to your students the three main functions all neurons have. The first of which is that all neurons receive inputs. Neurons receive inputs from the environment via specialized receptors, as illustrated on slide number 5, and via dendrites, as illustrated on slide number 6. The second function that all neurons complete is processing inputs. The inputs received from the dendrites are processed by the initial segment, which is the very first section of the axon. The initial segment calculates or processes all the inputs and determines whether or not to send a signal. The third function all neurons complete is sending signals. Neurons send signal via their axons and their synapses. Our axons vary in length from very, very short to very, very long. Axons send signal electrically, and this electrical signal, the action potential, will be the focus of our next lesson. Neurons send signal chemically via their synapses, which allow our neurons to communicate to other neurons and to muscles. After discussing the three main functions of our neurons and the parts that complete each, you'll review the parts of the neurons and their functions on slide number 13. This time asking students to name the function of each of the neurons' main structures: dendrite, cell body, initial segment, axon, and synapse. The slide also introduces two new terms, the presynaptic cell and the postsynaptic cell. These will be terms used throughout the module, so it is important that your students become familiar and comfortable with them. The key point of our second activity is to explore how neuronal structures are specialized for their function. Specifically, that dendrites can vary in level of their branching, and that axons can vary in length. We'll get to this key point by creating models of neuronal pathways, which students can do either with clay or simply by drawing. You'll divide the students into groups and have each group create a model of a neuronal pathway required for Joe to complete the action described on slide 14 and on the lesson worksheet. Remind the students to think about the different types of neurons required for different functions and how neuronal structures, specifically the dendrites and axons, can be specialized for specific functions. After giving the groups 5 to 10 minutes to create their model, have the groups present the models to the class and describe how they design specialized neurons to complete the tasks at hand. The key points of the wrap-up are to review that neuronal structures are highly specialized for their function, and just like snowflakes, no two neurons are created exactly the same. We'll get to these key points by comparing and contrasting Cajal's drawings. In the wrap-up, you'll introduce the students to Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who is often referred to as the father of neuroscience, because he was the first to describe neuronal structure. The pictures on slide 15 are some of his drawings and represent what neurons actually look like. You should make sure that your students are aware that we often simplify our drawings of neuronal structure and use cartoon versions to teach, but neurons do have very complicated structure. You'll ask the students, are all neurons created the same? No, they're not, but they all have the same basic structures, dendrite, cell body, axon, and complete the same basic functions, receive inputs, process inputs, and send signals. The key point of the homework is to explore how our choices change our brains. We'll get to this key point by working on our unit projects, which have students working independently or in small groups to research, describe, and present to the class how the different choices we make can change our brains. See the project section on our website for more information about the project and sample assignments and rubric sheets. This lesson is fairly straightforward, especially for students who have covered neurons in previous classes. That said, one of the most common questions teachers get is, if neurons are cells, why can't they divide to repair damage like other cells in our body? And it is a little weird that we can't replace neurons that get damaged, but the theory is that having neurons divide would do more harm than good. Each neuron has a specific place in our nervous system, so its job is all about taking signals from one place to another. So adding new neurons would mess up these very specific connections in a very complex system. So we trade off the ability to repair our neurons in order to avoid messing up these precise connections. Additionally, we used to think that people were born with all the neurons you were ever going to have and never generated new neurons, but neuroscientists have discovered that certain areas of our brain contain neural stem cells that maintain the ability to divide and thus generate new neurons throughout our life. This is another great example of how science is constantly discovering new things. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to describe the three main functions of all neurons: receive inputs, process inputs, and send signals. Students should also be able to identify how the primary structures of our neurons, dendrite, cell body, and axon, can be specialized to allow our neurons to carry out these functions. Neurons are the focus of this unit and the building blocks of our brains. Therefore, it is important that students understand the basic structures and functions of neurons before moving forward, because we'll be elaborating on these in the coming lessons. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members, and we'd be more than happy to help you.